those are my announcements. And now we'll bring in Colonel Lawrence Wilkerson to have a conversation with Dennis Fritz.
Okay, if I could make this introduction and we'll get us going with Larry and I. As you can imagine, me knowing what I knew, working in the Pentagon, I started writing my book, as I stated then, after I was watching Doug Feith write his book, based on cherry picking the intel. As I mentioned earlier, I got offered the opportunity to go over to Walter Reed to take care of our war wounded, specifically on the Air Force side of the house, to make sure their families were taken care of and any non-medical needs were met. As I tell the story, I could have been fired from that job many times because knowing what I knew, the politicians of the world, they want to come in and be seen. They were coming, voted for the war, mind you, and wanted to come in and see the wounded warriors and say, oh, thank you for your service. We love you. And that used to bother me. And I used to remind those senators and congressmen, you voted for this war that was based on a lie. And you're the reason that they are here. Don't thank them for their service. You thank me for my service. You thank them for their sacrifice because their families and them are going to be ruined for life. Amazing, I never got fired. I even made some members cry because I was giving them facts. And I said, the next time, this is my part again, we think about going to war, you better think about the folks I just introduced you to. Now, Larry wasn't immune from that. Larry was the first Bush administration official that I saw that came out and said, wait a minute. We led America down a dark road. And I saw an interview by him. And I said, I got to reach out to this guy. I think it was back in 2008, maybe. It's been a while now. We've been friends ever since. I said, I got to reach out to this guy. Though he's coming out and said we led America down a dark road, I want him to see what that dark road did to our men and women of our United States of America and to the country. And so I reached out to him by way of an email, thinking I'll never hear back from this guy. I think he was teaching at George Washington University at the time. And I found him and I sent him an email and told him who I was. And I said, hey, you work for a chairman. We have something in common. I work for a previous chairman, General Myers, and we have a lot in common. You can Google me, whatever, to say I'm not some crazy guy, off the street. And I told him I work at Walter Reed. And I said, I want you to come here and visit some of the troops to see what that war did to them. And guess what? A few days, I heard back from him. I was in shock. He said, yes, I'll come. And as I stated, he was not immune. He'll tell you about it. I introduced him to the most wounded individuals you can imagine. And it touched Larry. And I said, Larry, you have a platform. That's when he was all over the news, MSNBC, CNN. He was everywhere. I said, you have a platform, and I want you to use it to see what we, the United States of America, did to these young men and women and their families. And he said he would do it. But not only did he did it, he surpassed anything I would have imagined of him. And he remembered, I said, Larry, you have a platform, but I don't. And he'll tell you about it. I told him I was writing a book, but I was scared to write it. He kept pushing me. You got to do that book. I remember bringing him a binder, huge binder. We met for lunch. And I had pictures and everything. And I said, Larry, here's my book. And he was surprised. He said, you got to get that book out. Not only that, he said, Dennis, I'm going to get you a platform. And as you've heard, I'm the director of the Eisenhower Media Network. If it wasn't for Larry introducing me to the Eisenhower Media Network, I wouldn't be here today either. And so I'm indebted to Larry for his courage. He had to break away from Colin Powell. So I'm indebted to him. And when he came over to Walter Reed, I'll let him tell you about his experience. It touched him. And we've been friends ever since, fighting this battle together. And so, Larry, my man, I want to thank you for being my friend and fighting this battle together along with others. And I'll let Larry, please do deserve it. Then he'll tell you his side of how we came together, and then we'll sit here and talk and let like we do on the phone. We'll call each other and say we're only going to talk for 5 minutes. An hour later, we're still on the phone. One of us, oh, I got to go. I got an interview. It happens every time. Hey, it's going to be a quick phone call. And so we may have some of those phone calls right here before you. Share some information, some of the things that we talk about and what we learn. Larry?
Well, it was a little more self-interested than Dennis suggests. I had just been down on the Rose River in Virginia, trout fishing, and I had fly fishing, and I had stepped in a hole and cut about a 1.5 centimeter gap in my Achilles tendon. And so I was limping along the river back to my car, limped back to Washington. And I said, man, I got to have surgery on this. And I did. I had the Washington Redskins professional 10 years in service surgeon. I picked the best to do my foot because I knew it was in bad shape. He did the surgery, everything was fine, and afterwards he could not get the wound to heal. It just would not heal. And this was a very famous surgeon. He could not get it to heal. He called me in about 30 days after the surgery when it was apparent it wasn't going to heal, and he said, Larry, I got some bad news for you. You're going to have to see a wound expert. I said, Doc, a wound expert? He said, yeah, I cannot get your ankle to heal. I said, damn, I know, pardon me. I said, darn, I know the best wound experts in the world, and they're not in any phone book you have, Doc. They're at Washington Reed National Military Medical Center, where they've tended thousands of wounds over the last few years. I didn't know how to get in there. This guy, he got me in there. And not only did I meet him and get introduced, as he said, to a lot of these veterans of all the services, I got introduced to a nurse practitioner by the name of Kara Couch, who was unbelievable. The doctors and surgeons, plastic surgeons, other types of surgeons, all listened to her. They took her advice. I watched her every day that I went in for her medicinal, other types of alternative medicine treatments on my ankle, which eventually fixed it. And I listened to her talk to these doctors, and they listened to her. And often they took her advice on what to do in a particular plastic surgery operation or whatever it might be. And I also met people like this Special Forces captain who had a 5-year-old son who used to come with him to his consultations with Kara and her staff. And he was burned over about 75–80% of his body. And most of those burns were 2nd and 3rd degree burns. And it was obvious to me that, he was not going to have a very meaningful life in terms of physical exercise and his occupation and other things. And his son was watching all this happen all this time. And she would pack him with honey and other things that were alternative medicine type techniques. And she was doing some good, but as she explained to me, there wasn't a whole lot she could do except ease his pain and make his life a little bit softer than it otherwise would be. I ran into a lot of people, a second lieutenant female standing in profile to me, left profile, and I'm looking at her, very lovely young lady, probably about 22, 23 or so. And when she saw me come into the treatment room, she turned towards me and she had no right arm, from the elbow gone. She was getting ready to enter physical therapy under Kara's tutelage and some other people on her staff. So I got to see all of this, but the most dramatic one was Dennis introduced me to the Air Force's, at that time, only triple amputee. He was in Afghanistan. I think it was his second tour, Iraq one time and then Afghanistan. He was almost at the end of his tour in Afghanistan. He was defusing an IED, improvised explosive device, one day, just short of his departure. His tour was up. He was in his full gear, and he was down looking at the IED, and he had a comm problem, so he was hitting his helmet. He couldn't hear his partner, who was 100 meters or so down the line per protocol. So he stood up and hit his helmet, and the only reason he survived was he stood up. The IED was command detonated, went off, in other words, took both his legs off and his right arm. So he's a gentleman sitting at the table with me and Dennis one day, and a Marine was sitting there with his right leg below the knee missing, and the Marine was saying things to me like, "Man, I'm in good shape compared to him." And they were laughing back and forth, but there was no laughter really in the triple amputee's face. And he told me a story I'll never forget, and Dennis just rehearsed a little bit of it. But this was very powerful for me. He said he had just had a good morning. I said, "Oh?" He said, "Yep. Not only did I find out that they've outfitted a van for me, it was donated, $250,000, I think he said. Somebody donated it to him, and he could drive it because it was all equipped so he could drive it." But he said the really good thing that happened to me was I was in my room, and a congressional delegation walked in. And they started, as usual, thanking me for my service right off the bat. And I stopped them. I just stopped them. I said, "No, no, 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 no. Don't thank me for my service. I'm conflicted over that. Thank me for my sacrifice. You can clearly see that." And he said they turned around and left. And he said that was his best thing that happened to him in a long time. But that's how he felt. That's really how he felt. And the whole time he's telling the story, the Marine was going, "Yeah, I feel the same way. Don't thank me for my service again, because I'll poke you in the eye if you do." Because these are not stupid young men and women. They knew they'd been used, and they knew they had paid dearly for that maluse. So that's how I came to really appreciate what Dennis was doing.
Yeah. I can tell you, the individual we're talking about, imagine me not writing this book when I think about him. As I said, my job was to take care of the non-medical needs, take care of their families. When he was wounded, we had to reach out to his wife, who was 7 months pregnant at the time. And we had to fly her into Washington, D.C. And of course, going through all that trauma, she had
19 surgeries, I think.
Wait, that's Des. Yeah, he had 19 surgeries. But at the same time, the trauma of him going through that, she had an early delivery, premature delivery. And so on the same day, you had him going, I didn't mention his name, but, with Des for short, and going through a surgery while she was up on the next floor delivering. And then one thing that struck with me, man, I got to, I'm going to be that brave guy now here, but if it doesn't touch your heart, you're not human. For him to reach out to me after the baby was born, and for him to tell me, "Hey, Chief, what hurts me most is that I will not be able to hold my baby, in both of my arms." That destroyed me, and I had to write this book. I wanted him to know, and others, we can't allow this to happen again on lies. It's a different story if we're really defending our country, but we going to these wars on lies. The good news about that, not only were we able to equip him with a van, he could actually drive this thing. It was good, but we were able to get him prosthetic arms where he could hold his baby. That's a good news story. Think about this: a young man who was badly burned, the entire face was burned, and his mom would come out of the room, his room every day and cry every morning. And finally, the young man's dad said, "Hey, Chief, I know you probably wonder why she cries every day." I said, "Sir, no, that's her son." This young man was 19, but he was so badly burned, he was traumatized. The face was traumatized. You would have thought he was 80. And the father told me that his mom, God, she had such a firm belief in God that she felt the next morning she walked in that room, he was going to be healed. And when it wasn't happening, she would cry every day, leave out the room. The father showed me a picture of him. Man, was he handsome. Handsome. And that's what his mom had to see every day, her child. This happened because it was a lie. He lost both eyes, face messed up for the rest of his life. We can't let that happen again. We got to be loud. I want to challenge the churches. I'm going to another church in May. I want to challenge you. You all need to be loud with this. We can't allow the killing of innocent women and children, and we can't allow wars based on lies.
And think about 150 to 200,000, because that's the true number, half of whom are children and women in Gaza and on the West Bank who've gone through the same pain and misery.
Well, let me comment on that. Larry and I, we went on the Hill. If you heard of Doctors Against Genocide, we went on Capitol Hill with them to have an audience with members of Congress. We only got a few, maybe two, to see them. But worse than that, they were treated like criminals.
Yeah.
Larry and I sent in a protest letter. Now, how do I raise that? As Larry mentioned to you, we were able to get him some of the care. Larry's not telling the story. It was a possibility Larry may not have walked again, from that injury not healing. But we were able to get him some of the best care. So think about what we have at Walter Reed. Walter Reed had some of the best care for amputees and burns, also down in Texas. What's happening in Gaza right now, what happened to Dez, the young man I said face was fully burned, is happening to those kids right now in Gaza. And guess what? They don't have the care that Larry had and that the Dez's had and that the Mike had.
They don't even have food to eat.
And they don't have anesthesia. We talk to the doctors. They don't, and guess what? Our government is complicit in that. And you think I'm going to shut up?
And if you're a doctor and you are saving lives, no matter what they are, children, women, whatever, they're going to arrest you.
Or shoot you.
Because they don't want you saving those lives.
Or shoot you. Some of the doctors say they have to fear for their lives every day. That's our government. And they don't want us to speak about that. Fool us once, shame on them. Fool us again, shame on us. Okay, I see